Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Anatomy of a Murder, starring James Stewart, Lee Remick, Gazzara, Eve Arden, George C. Scott, Joseph N. Welch, Catherine Grant, and Arthur O'Connell, directed by Otto Preminger. Now, before I get into this movie, I just reviewed Anatomy of a Fall, and the two movies are kind of like the same similar movies with plot versus the title, except the only difference is one is fall and the other one's murder. So, will this be as good as Anatomy of a Fall, or better, or worse? As I've seen this movie one time, don't remember it too well. So, let's get into it and let's see how this goes. In the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, small town lawyer Paul Beegler, played by James Stewart, goes to a bar to his house and gets a letter from Lieutenant Frederick Manny Mannion, played by Ben Gazzara, and he calls the house, and we get Paul's alcoholic friend and colleague Parnell McCarthy, played by Arthur O'Connell, coming in and has a drink and with Paul. And this opener is great, and I like the characters, and the acting is very well done. Paul gets a call from Laura Mannion, played by Lee Remick, about the rape, and yes, she was raped off screen, never see it, as Manny killed someone named Barney Quill, and who was the raper, I'll say, of Laura, and he doesn't know whether or not he should take the case. But the next day comes, and Paul's secretary, Maida Rutledge, played by Eve Arden, comes in and chats with Paul. As we get to Paul's office, Laura comes to see Paul about the car of who murdered, or about the car, about the case of who murdered her. Well, no, not her husband, but what's his name? Quill. And while she has a doggy with her, and Laura shows Paul her black eye as she was punched by Bernard Barney Quill, like I brought up earlier. And her husband Manny was arrested for first-degree murder, and she takes Barney to court, and he talks with the sheriff in town, who happens to be Manny, and questions what happened, or well, it's different, someone else. Let me move on. And questions Manny about what happened to Laura on the night Barney raped her, again off screen, by the way. And this movie does a very good job at giving the truth versus the lie, as I am hooked into this movie. And the cinematography, despite this is in black and white, is amazing to see on screen. Laura goes to the home of Paul and plays music while Maida listens to it, and Paul gets to know Laura as he offers her a cigarette. But she has one and offered him a light to light it for her, as well as a beer, while she's thirsty, as well as the doggy is thirsty. And and it goes to sleep, the doggy, I mean, and they talk about what happened to Barney, and I'm starting to think this is a courtroom drama. And I'm always a fan of those, like I brought up in Anatomy of a Fall. I'm kind of a sucker for these movies. And this type of movie works for me, as it always engages me. I didn't bring that up last time, but yeah, you get my point. Paul is unsure if he wants to take the case, as it'll depend on what Manny says, and Parnell is asked by Paul to lay off the alcohol for the night. And the next day comes, and Paul has a meeting with Manny and decides to take the case based on what Manny said, while he sits in jail for now, and he visits District Attorney Mitch Lodwick, saying he'll take the case, and goes to Laura and asks her Barney about Barney stealing her underpants, or panties at best. And they go in his car, and this movie looks great, as this is turning into a great movie. Paul does some investigating around a bar where the murder happened, and Paul has a talk with an employee, and we move on to Parnell at the bar with his friends, and he meets with Maida to talk about the case, and Parnell has a chat with the waitress, Mary Pylant, played by Catherine Grant, who happened to be an employee of Barney, as she doesn't know much about what happened with the murder. And Manny shows Paul a letter he got from the army while in jail, and we get a dance club, and I'm enjoying myself viewing this movie the two times I saw it for the show. Yes, I watched it twice. Paul happens to take Laura out of the dance club, as he takes her to a view at the hill to her home, and we get to the first court scene with Judge Weaver. And I'm honestly a sucker for courtroom dramas, as this movie works great. The court case begins. Meanwhile, Paul meets with Parnell, and Manny took some notes and shows them to Paul, and Paul and Parnell talk with Manny in the room, and they go to the library and get some information about how he can win the case. And we begin another court day as the audience gets introduced to Cloud Dancer, played by Patton himself, George C. Scott. And he asks for a brief recess to tell his side of the story, and we continue with the court day. And this is gripping me on the edge of my seat, as these court scenes are pretty intense. And Paul meets with Maida after the court session, and he asks where Parnell is at. And we move on to the next court scene, and the psychiatrist, Dr. W. Gregory Harcourt, is introduced and is questioned by both lawyers, who happens to be Paul and Cloud, as they ask Alphonse Paquette, questions, as well as Judge Lemon and Detective Sergeant James Durgo, as he fires Maida. And I'm actually having a good time with the movie at this point. Judge Weaver makes a strict rule over laughing about panties, and they take a 30-minute recess as Laura gives a cigarette to Manny and lights it up, and we move on to a Dr. Dompierre being the next witness, as well as another guy who asks Laura to take off her hat, while Paul asks Laura to stand up, and Cloud continues the questions, and we get Judge Weaver ending the case on Saturday night, and Parnell gets into an accident and is hospitalized, and Paul visits him, as well as Mary Pollant, at a bar, while she didn't feel happy to see Paul, as he wants her to have a word with her and tells her to persuade one of her co-workers, Al, how she doesn't know the truth about Barney, as he was her father. And he knows something about Al, and he puts Al and Mary on the pass list into the courtroom. And we get back to the courtroom, and Paul asks Manny questions about what happened that night. And Manny keeps coming up with "I don't know" as an answer, which at one point he shows the gun having no bullets in it to Paul and everybody in the audience, while Cloud questions Manny and gets very intense about it. And this movie is gripping and engaging, in my opinion. Laura gets called to ask questions, while Mary gets to the courtroom and sees Laura is answering questions, and she brought up how Manny says he killed Barney, and they bring the doggy in the courtroom, and to show the doggy, he turned on the light, as it is well trained, and Cloud asks Laura questions, and at one point Paul says objection and tells him to stop, or else he'll punch Cloud outside the room, which was pretty funny, and she confesses she was afraid of Barney, as she was raped by him, like I brought up earlier in the beginning of the show, as Laura was uncertain her answer to Cloud's question, and Cloud asks why Manny slapped Laura, because she was hysterical, and Cloud takes it too far, which is typical of him, I'll say. Parnell meets with Dr. Matthew Smith, and he takes Dr. Smith to the courthouse, while Paul asks him questions about the case, and so does Cloud, while Paul asks where Mary went, as he learns she left after lunch, and Paul and Cloud meet with Judge Weaver, as Cloud wants Paul to change his mind and his side is guilty, and Paul refuses, and Cloud asks Dr. Harcourt questions about the case, so does Paul, and Cloud asks Dwayne Duke Miller to the question stage, and Cloud asking him some questions until Manny bursts out after Duke tells Cloud a lie, and Paul asks Duke questions and asks for his records, as saying he's a criminal, while Parnell gets asked outside, and Manny is asked to the question table, and Paul and Cloud asked his questions, and Paul asks Manny if he hit his wife, and says no, Manny does, and Parnell tells Paul someone is outside as he comes and gets Mary to the question table, and Paul starts asking her questions about what happened between Barney and Manny, and so does Cloud, as he's going rather harsh with Mary as far as her panties are concerned, and confuses her to death and scares the hell out of her, and she confesses to the courtroom she's Barney's daughter, As we move on to Paul playing the piano in his house slash office, and we get to the next day as well as the closing argument, and the jury believes Manny is not guilty, and Laura's waiting for Manny in the car, and Paul and Parnell drive away to a forest at a camping site to have a talk with Manny, but he leaves a note saying he had to get out of town while they get to their next case, and this climax was a heck of a lot of fun. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 8.6 out of 10. I was engaged throughout the movie as I'm always a sucker for a good movie that's set in a courtroom like this. And Anatomy of a Fall and this as this I like the characters and the acting is well done. Despite the movie was in black and white, the cinematography in this was amazing to watch on the screen, and in my opinion, as I was hooked into the movie from start to finish, and this movie works great. There is a reason this movie is one of the classics and why it was added on my 4K collection of the Columbia Classics Volume 2. Yes, this is a long movie, sure, 2 hours and 40 minutes. This is a great movie that looks great, as I really enjoyed the movie the 2 times I viewed for the show, as this is a solid recommendation, and this movie works great as a courtroom drama, and in my opinion, nothing against Anatomy of a Fall, but it is better than that, in my opinion. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with Oliver. And until then, the case is closed.